The humidity hangs thick over Bien Hoa Air Base in July 1967, the kind of wet heat that makes flight suits cling to skin and turns metal hot enough to burn bare hands. Lieutenant Commander Rick Martinez stands beside his A-4 Skyhawk in the pre-dawn darkness, watching maintenance crews attach what the other pilots have started calling Martinez's Folly, a bulky electronic countermeasures pod that hangs beneath the fuselage like an unwanted tumor, disrupting the aircraft's clean aerodynamic lines. The modification adds weight, costs speed, reduces payload capacity. Wing commanders hate it. Mission planners question it. Fellow pilots mock it openly in the ready room, calling it a security blanket for someone who lacks confidence in his flying skills. The official position from Naval Air Systems Command is unambiguous. The modification represents unauthorized alteration of approved aircraft configuration, violates standard operating procedures, and Lieutenant Commander Martinez is hereby ordered to remove the equipment and never install it again. He signs the paperwork acknowledging the order, files it in his locker, and tells the maintenance chief to keep the pod attached anyway. 3 weeks later, that decision will save 9 pilots from surface-to-air missiles that Soviet doctrine says cannot miss. And the same commanders who ordered him to remove the modification will be writing commendations explaining why he was right to ignore their orders. To understand why Martinez defied direct commands to pursue a modification the Navy did not want, one must first comprehend what American aviators faced in the skies over North Vietnam in the summer of 1967. The SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile system, provided by the Soviet Union and operated by North Vietnamese Air Defense Forces, had transformed aerial warfare. These missiles could engage targets at altitudes up to 60,000 feet, could track aircraft through clouds and darkness using sophisticated radar guidance, could accelerate to 3 times the speed of sound, making evasion nearly impossible once locked on target. American losses to SAMs had climbed steadily throughout 1966 and into 1967. Pilots would be flying straight and level, executing their attack runs when radar warning receivers would scream missile launch alerts. Standard evasion procedures, hard turns, chaff deployment, diving for terrain masking, sometimes worked, often did not. The mathematics were brutal. Once an SA-2 achieved radar lock, pilot survival probability dropped below 40%. Soviet engineers had created a system specifically designed to defeat the tactics American pilots used, and those tactics were failing with increasing frequency. Martinez had come to naval aviation through an unconventional route. Before flight school, he had studied electrical engineering at MIT, had worked briefly for Raytheon developing radar systems, understood the physics of how radio waves propagated, and how receivers detected and tracked targets. When his squadron began losing aircraft to SAMs at rates that seemed unsustainable, he started thinking about the problem not as a pilot, but as an engineer. The SA-2 system relied on continuous radar tracking to guide the missile to its target. Break that radar lock, even momentarily, and the missile would lose its target and have to reacquire, buying precious seconds for evasion. But how to break radar lock? Chaff created temporary clutter but dispersed quickly. Maneuvering could work, but required diving into the effective range of anti-aircraft guns. What if, Martinez wondered, you could generate false radar returns that confused the tracking system, made the radar think the target was somewhere it was not, created enough uncertainty that the missile's guidance computers could not maintain accurate solutions? The equipment Martinez needed existed but was classified expensive, reserved for specialized electronic warfare aircraft rather than standard attack planes, so he built his own. Using components scrapped from damaged electronics, parts ordered through unofficial channels, and modifications that violated probably a dozen different regulations, Martinez assembled a crude, electronic countermeasures system that could detect SAM radar emissions and generate interference patterns. It was not sophisticated, nothing like the purpose-built systems carried by EA-6B prowlers, but it worked on the test bench in the maintenance shop, creating false returns that fooled radar scopes. The problem was weight. The homemade system and its power supply added nearly 400 pounds to an aircraft already operating at maximum gross weight. It reduced top speed by 15 knots. It required drilling mounting holes in the fuselage structure. It was, by every standard metric the Navy used to evaluate modifications, a bad idea that made the aircraft perform worse while providing unproven benefits. Martinez flew the modified aircraft anyway, on missions where his wingmen flew clean birds with standard configurations. And he noticed something interesting. While other aircraft in the strike package would receive multiple missile launch warnings, would spend their ingress dodging SAMs and maneuvering violently, Martinez's radar warning receiver stayed relatively quiet. When SA-2s did launch in his direction, they seemed more accurate, their terminal guidance less certain, their proximity fuses detonating at greater distances. He could not prove causation. Maybe he was just lucky. Maybe North Vietnamese operators were having off days. But the correlation was suggestive. His aircraft, the one carrying the unauthorized modification everyone else ridiculed, seemed to be attracting less effective SAM engagement than the clean birds flying beside him. The resistance to Martinez's modification reflected institutional conservatism that pervaded military aviation in the 1960s. Aircraft were designed by engineers, tested exhaustively, approved through elaborate review processes. Pilots were expected to fly the aircraft as designed, not modify them based on personal theories. When Martinez submitted a formal proposal to test his countermeasures system more broadly, Naval Air Systems Command responded with a detailed rejection letter explaining that unauthorized modifications violated safety regulations, that anecdotal observations did not constitute proof of effectiveness, that if the Navy wanted electronic countermeasures on attack aircraft, the Navy would develop them through proper channels. The letter concluded with a direct order: remove the unauthorized equipment, restore the aircraft to standard configuration, and do not attempt further modifications without explicit approval. Martinez read the letter, understood that his career could end if he continued, and decided that saving pilots' lives mattered more than following orders he believed were wrong. The transformation came on August 11, 1967, during a strike package against the Dan Hoa Bridge. 12 aircraft, a mix of A-4 Skyhawks and F-8 Crusaders, approached the target in the early afternoon, intelligence having identified a brief window when weather over the target area would be clear enough for visual bombing. North Vietnamese air defenses had been waiting, had positioned SAM batteries specifically to engage aircraft during their attack runs when they were most vulnerable, flying predictable approaches at predictable speeds. The radar warning receivers began screaming even before the American aircraft crossed the coast, indicating multiple SAM sites, tracking, preparing to fire. Martinez was flying in the number 3 position, his aircraft carrying the unauthorized countermeasures pod, while his wingmen flew clean birds. He activated his homemade system, felt it drawing power, hoped the modifications would work under combat conditions as they had during testing. The first SAMs launched seconds later. white telephone poles trailing flame rising from jungle clearings, arcing upward toward the American formation. Standard doctrine called for immediate evasive action, break lock, deploy chaff, dive for the deck. But Martinez noticed something strange on his radar warning receiver. While the display showed continuous tracking signals illuminating other aircraft in the formation, the signal painting his own aircraft was intermittent, flickering, struggling to maintain lock. His countermeasures system was working, was generating enough interference to degrade the tracking radar's ability to maintain continuous guidance. He stayed on his attack run, released his bombs accurately on target, pulled up and away, while SA-2s detonated around other aircraft that had broken off their attacks to evade. 2 F-8s took damage from missile fragments. 1 A-4 was destroyed outright, the pilot ejecting and being captured. Martinez's aircraft, flying through the same missile engagement zone, took no damage. The countermeasures had worked. The sound of the radar warning receiver became the symbolic element that defined the experience. That urgent beeping that announced missile tracking, that accelerated into a steady tone when launch was imminent, that filled the cockpit with electronic screaming that signaled imminent death. Every pilot in Vietnam knew that sound, dreaded it, had nightmares where that beeping would not stop. What made Martinez's modification significant was not that it eliminated the threat, SAMs still launched, still had to be evaded, but that it changed the sound's meaning. With the countermeasures active, the radar warning receiver's tone became intermittent, unstable, indicating that the enemy radar was struggling to maintain lock rather than tracking confidently. That difference in sound, subtle but unmistakable to pilots who lived and died by electronic warnings, represented the difference between helpless target and degraded threat. The mission debrief that evening became contentious. Martinez reported his observations about the effectiveness of his countermeasures system, noted that his aircraft had been the only one in the strike package that completed its attack run without breaking off for evasive maneuvers, that he had taken no damage despite flying through the same SAM engagement zone that had damaged or destroyed 3 other aircraft. The intelligence officer was skeptical. Correlation was not causation. Maybe the SAM operators had simply missed. Maybe Martinez had been lucky. The squadron commander was furious. Martinez had been explicitly ordered to remove the unauthorized modification, had violated direct orders, had exposed government property to unknown risks by flying equipment that had never been properly tested or approved. But the other pilots in the ready room were listening differently now. They had been mocking Martinez's folly for weeks, had joked about his security blanket and his unwillingness to fly a real aircraft. Now they were asking questions. How did the system work? Could it be installed on their aircraft? How long would it take to build more pods? Within 72 hours, Naval Air Systems Command dispatched a technical team to Bien Hoa to evaluate Martinez's modification. The team consisted of electronics engineers, weapons system specialists, and lawyers trying to figure out what regulations Martinez had violated and whether those violations constituted grounds for court-martial. What they found surprised them. The homemade countermeasures system was crude, assembled from scrapped components and unofficial parts, but it worked. It generated interference patterns that degraded SAM tracking radar effectiveness measurably. It did so without compromising the aircraft's basic flight characteristics or safety, and most importantly, it seemed to provide a survival advantage that existing approved systems did not. The engineers could not officially endorse an unauthorized modification assembled in violation of procurement regulations and safety standards, but they could, and did, recommend immediate development of a properly engineered version based on Martinez's design principles. The loss ratios told a story that even skeptical commanders could not ignore. Strike packages flying with aircraft equipped with Martinez's countermeasures, either his original homemade version or the rapidly developed official variants, experienced SAM-related losses at roughly half the rate of packages flying clean aircraft. The difference was not merely statistical, but visceral. Pilots flying with the countermeasures reported feeling less helpless when missile launches occurred, reported being able to complete attack runs rather than breaking off immediately for evasion, reported that the urgent beeping of the radar warning receiver no longer signified inevitable catastrophe, but rather a threat that could be managed. The modification that commanders had ordered removed, that pilots had mocked as folly, that violated regulations and procurement procedures, was saving lives at a rate that made those concerns seem bureaucratic and petty compared to the fundamental question of bringing pilots home alive. By October 1967, the Navy had awarded Martinez a Distinguished Flying Cross for his unauthorized modifications and their contribution to combat effectiveness. The citation carefully avoided mentioning that he had violated direct orders to achieve those results, focused instead on innovative problem-solving and dedication to mission success. More significantly, the Navy established a rapid prototyping program that allowed pilots with technical expertise to propose and test modifications without requiring the years-long approval process that normal procurement channels demanded. Martinez's folly had become Martinez's innovation, and the institutional resistance that had nearly ended his career had transformed into institutional embrace of the principles he had demonstrated, that frontline operators sometimes understood problems better than distant administrators, that unconventional solutions deserved evaluation rather than automatic rejection, that regulations designed to ensure safety and effectiveness could sometimes accomplish the opposite. The 9 pilots whose lives the countermeasures system definitively saved documented cases where SA-2s would have achieved lethal intercepts, except that electronic interference degraded their guidance enough to create survivable missed distances, never flew in formation with Martinez, never met him personally, never knew that the equipment protecting them originated with an engineer-turned-pilot who had violated direct orders because he believed he was right and the orders were wrong. They returned to carriers, to bases, to families who would never know how close death had come, or what unauthorized modification had kept their husbands and fathers alive. The calculations that would have listed them as combat losses, that would have added their names to casualty reports and memorial walls, remained forever theoretical, counterfactual, impossible to prove but emotionally certain to pilots who understood what those flickering radar warning tones meant. And so, we return to that moment at Bien Hoa in July 1967, to Lieutenant Commander Martinez standing beside his modified A-4 while maintenance crews attach the pod that commanders have ordered removed, that fellow pilots mock, that regulations prohibit. The humidity is still oppressive, the metal still hot to touch, the war still grinding forward with losses that seem unsustainable. But something has changed, something invisible to observers but tangible to the pilot who understands that obedience to authority is not always identical to doing what is right, that regulations serve purposes, but those purposes can be wrong, that sometimes saving lives requires violating orders and accepting whatever consequences follow. The pod hangs beneath the fuselage, ugly and heavy and unauthorized, carrying inside its improvised housing the possibility that radar locks can be broken, that missiles can be confused, that pilots can return home who would otherwise have died. The sound it prevents, the steady tone of the radar warning receiver indicating certain SAM guidance, is a sound that will not be heard, a death that will not occur, a telegram that will not arrive at 9 different homes because one pilot decided that his judgment mattered more than his orders. That decision, unauthorized and insubordinate and ultimately vindicated, speaks to a truth about warfare and bureaucracy and the relationship between frontline operators and distant administrators. That expertise matters more than authority, that innovation requires tolerance for deviation, that the rules designed to protect can sometimes kill when they prevent the changes that survival demands. Martinez's forbidden modification, mocked and ordered removed, and eventually saving 9 lives whose owners never knew they were threatened, stands as testament to the necessity of questioning, the danger of blind obedience, the possibility that being right sometimes requires being insubordinate, and the ultimate judgment that history renders not on those who followed regulations, but on those whose violations proved, in blood and survival, to have been justified by results that regulations could neither predict nor prevent.